Hello and welcome to Indie Encounter. My name is Sandra Lorraine Coleman. The mission of our show is to give independent performers and artists access to as wide an audience as possible and to give you, our viewers, a window into their art, their artistic process, and why they have chosen their particular avenue to connect with the world. All art is about communication and connection. Let's meet today's indie artist, Jawanza Dumasani. Welcome, Jawanza. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It is wonderful to be here with you, Sandra.
Thank you so much. I want to get started right away by asking you, I heard you talking earlier about the difference between spoken word and poetry, and I've had other guests on the show, and I would like to hear your viewpoint, your take on the difference between spoken word and poetry.
I think the spoken word, which has probably eclipsed almost the existence of man himself. But language on the page is such that even when the artist is dead and in the ground, the words still resonate on the page.
Wow.
And I think that's the difference between spoken word and poetry.
Wow. That I never thought about it like that before. It makes a lot of sense. And you're absolutely right. Even if the artist is no longer with us, we can go back and look at their work and it still has just as much meaning as it did when they were here. So I would have to say I agree with that. And thank you very much for sharing. Now I want to ask you about the world stage. And I know you're the program director for the Anansi Writers Workshop. So tell us a little bit about what goes on at the world stage and what you do.
Well, each Wednesday night we begin our program with a writer's workshop. And this is that process where the collective meet in a room, share their poetry, and then there is a process of back and forth to make those poems better. And then we have a featured reader each week. We give them a 30-minute reading period, and then the last hour of the evening we have an open mic.
Oh, so it's a full program.
A full program. And that open mic time is at the evening. Now, a lot of venues will have the open mic first. But we choose to have it at the end because once the open mic readers see the featured reader, it inspires them to not only have better readings of their work, but to write better poems too.
And that makes a lot of sense that it will come at the end, because I know sometimes when I go to a poetry venue and sometimes I don't always want to perform. I just want to sit and listen. And so it gives me an opportunity to hear and feel besides, being a performer or on, all the time. I don't always want to be on. So tell us a little bit about that, like when you're performing and some of the things that you do to get ready for a performance.
Well, I always feel like reading poems is almost like an actor acting on a stage set.
Right.
So when you read poetry, for me, I try to become the poem. And more times than not, if I'm reading poems publicly, I've probably read them 40 or 50 times in a mirror. So that, and I don't necessarily try to memorize the poems,
right,
but I do try to become familiar with them so that, one, I'm not buried in the page.
right,
Two, when I make eye contact with the audience,
right,
they're drawn into the poem.
right, right.
And also, when you know the poems intimately like that, there's certain inflections that you put on certain parts of the poem, certain areas where you draw back.
Right.
And this intensifies the experience that the listening audience has.
Right. And then you learn where to put each accent or take away something or, go up or down, or Makes a lot of sense. But a lot of people don't know that, and a lot of people don't do that. So I want to thank you for sharing that. And since we were talking about that, would you like to share a poem with us right now?
I'd be happy to. This first poem, I'm going to read this. It's called Furlough.
Mm-hmm.
My cousin, who I grew up with as a child, spent 27 years incarcerated.
Wow.
And he recently got out. Now, in 1997, I had an opportunity to go back to my hometown, Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
for his father's funeral, my uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a poem about that day. It was almost surreal.
Wow.
In that my cousin, who was incarcerated, was brought to the funeral.
Oh, okay.
It's simply called Furlough. A lemon silk dirge and clang of leg irons drag apart the silence. Three jailers whisper up stone as redwood in a cornfield. Usher Charles Edward to this sanctuary bloodhounds would have never found. Gospel should have been law. Regret plummets through a hellhole as survival bends at the seam. Northbound, faux poplar lost favor. Uncle Isaiah's eulogy utters a lifetime of deliverance. Licks, bowls of French vanilla, we put our foot in and took turns churning. From a wheelchair, Aunt Mariah don't even wail. Just mourns in quiet sorrow, soothed by kinfolk grace and first son's furlough. Shook from sleep neath Lucifer's weed, I reminisce from the third pew. If me and cuz could trim a spruce, spin harmless lies as apologies drift from Smokey's lips, I'd spot him one more chance at 9 ball for 10. Look in his eyes and ask why desire cocks the trigger with a syringe. As cell block D gnaws like cancer in his shoe. There's more to living than breath. Prayer beats up in my niece's throat. Her anguish brings a turnkey to his knees.
Wow. Wow.
See, that afternoon, I was inside Charlie's head. I couldn't say anything to him,
Right. Right.
but I could only imagine
Yeah.
what he and my aunt and all of his siblings were going through at that
we're
moment.
going through and what they were thinking. Yeah. Well, I think you said it very well. You know, helping us to see, you know, what was going on in that moment in time, you know, when your cousin was furloughed too. Wow. I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't, but I think you did a wonderful job of helping us to see a little bit.
A little.
A little, because we could never. But I think that's what poetry does. It gives us an opportunity. It creates these images. It paints these pictures, and it allows the people who weren't there to be there, even if it's just a little bit. Yeah, and I want to say I appreciate you for that. And I want to also talk about your voice when you deliver, because your voice changed. It got a little deeper. You know, when you were talking to me, it was one way, and then when you, so like you said, you just explained that about going into this zone or this character or like acting.
Yes, poems, you know, that's when I mentioned seeing really wonderful poets with less than spirited readings. Now, clearly, once you, and there is, something called how to read a poem.
Right.
Even if you're not a poet.
Right.
And I think in that context, the more poems one reads, the better one becomes at understanding poems.
Right.
Because in the reading, you can read a poem several hundred times.
Right.
And the 701 time you read that poem, there may be a window into something that you perhaps didn't notice before. And so each time you read, and that's what's so entertaining about poetry. It's not read the poem once, put the book away.
Right.
It's read the poem over and over and over.
Yeah, it's practice.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yes.
keep it, just like with writing, you can't just, like the workshop, you can't just write something on paper and say it's a poem, it's poetry, and then go out and speak it and, have everybody believe it, because people who really know poetry and really write poetry are going to know if it is or not.
Right.
So you can't play games with, this is not a game, this is a real, valid, true, honest art. And having said that, I want you to share with us about Treasures, a project that you're working on for the world stage.
Treasures is a concept whereby all of us artists, musicians, poets, singers, dancers, are all thrown into a room. Much like, imagine Motown in the beginning.
Ooh.
When all the artists were put into a room. And in doing so, first of all, now you have a collective.
Right.
And clearly, as a collective, we're much stronger than any single one of us. And it's also, I think, a perfect way to market all of us. Because you have musicians in one room, poets in another room, and most artists are not very good at the marketing part of it.
Right.
And that is a problem for the Black Arts Movement.
Right.
Or what we call the Black Arts Movement. I would love to see a renaissance like in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
Now, that movement was spawned by not Treasures in itself, but a collective like that.
Right.
And that's why I feel that Treasures is a area that we will kind of push that envelope back to that sort of thinking.
Okay. So it's a collective of artists coming together to perform music, poetry, and like dance. Is there?
Well, it's not just perform, because any venue can throw a dancer on the stage, get someone up to read a poem.
Right.
But when all of that is threaded into a narrative that tells a story,
Right.
that in effect will grow into what I will call, for the sake of this discussion, a poetry opera, where maybe we have 20 dancers,
Right.
an orchestra, singers, all driven by the poetic narrative.
Wow.
So that is Treasures grown up. In its infancy, it is a series of vignettes that incorporate all of these different artists and talents that share a small little story. And perhaps, if I'm invited back on the program,
Right.
we'll share one of those little vignettes with you.
Well, of course, we would love to invite you back to share a vignette, but right now we want to have you do another poem for us.
Okay, we're gonna make this a community effort.
Okay. I
we're
like
gonna,
that.
We're gonna have you be the voice of my mother,
Okay.
and this is simply called Wife's Counsel. And just to give you a backstory, my parents left the South in the 40s, and my dad had worked in the coal mines and had the unfortunate mishap of being pinned for several days. And after he was drug out of the coal mine, he was pretty much done as far as working in the coal mine, so they came north. And it's simply called Wife's Counsel.
Okay.
Precious Geneva, every choir my song. Jim Crow holds us hostage, but there's a cornucopia beyond magnolia's bloom. Mine and coal done robbed me of earth's last silo. Paydays cross-examine us, asking the same questions again and again.
A harp inside your voice whispers autumn. Someday, dearest Roy, water recedes, cottonwood pricks free. 2 days and old purgatory may haunt us, honey. Be blessed, man, and plant orchids at dawn. Leaving our bread with sacrifice, pay prosperity's wage, finally sit where we please. Careful, my love, your color still has the power to convict. Wow. Wow.
Sends chills up my spine.
I bet.
My dad spent one night in prison that I'm aware of, in jail, in the county jail.
Right.
And he got into a little altercation in traffic once they had arrived in Detroit. And I remember sitting around the dinner table, I must have been 7 or 8, and my dad and his uncles were talking about that incident. And apparently, my dad had gotten into this altercation, and when the police arrived, this man was out cold on the pavement.
Ooh.
And when they brought him to, he claimed that my dad struck him with a hammer. And of course, my father was taken to jail, and a few days he was, appeared in court.
Right.
And the charges were dropped. But he clearly struck him with his fist because his third knuckle was still oozing from the blow.
Wow. Yeah. And, sometimes stories like that, like about your dad, you said you heard your uncles, talking about it, but there are so many stories about ourselves, our culture, our history that we don't know because we either don't listen when somebody's talking or we just don't know where to go to get the information.
That's interesting. You know what? In my family, I think a lot of African American families, there's not a lot of talking.
Right.
There's talking at.
Right.
But much of the stories that I know about my family, I actually found out through relatives. After I became an adult. Many of the stories that I write about in the poems, I've gotten from other family members and not directly from my mother or father's mouth,
Right.
And I think that's often the way we get our stories, because if we hear them from our parents, typically we hear one side or the other.
Right.
When the relatives are sort of back from what's happening, and they have a much, much clearer perspective.
Right.
So that when we hear the stories, typically we hear the whole perspective.
Right.
Versus, one parent or the other, which is, I think, probably a better way to get the stories.
Probably. Yeah, it probably is. And I want to ask you about, because I know a lot of poets are concerned with documenting, like right now, history, current events, things that I was just saying earlier, stories that we don't know about ourselves, our culture, our history. And a lot of poets are using poetry as a means to communicate with the youth. Now tell us, how do you feel about that? Because I noticed the World Stage has workshops in a series for youth as well.
Well, I've always felt that poetry should have a historical context too, especially for us.
Right.
So that the stories, our history, can be shared through the art.
Right.
Many times, the real true history is not going to be in the history books.
Right.
So it's really up to the artists to preserve those stories, to preserve that history. Otherwise, without the written word, that history would be lost.
Right. Absolutely. And so you have these programs for the youth. And so what are some of the things that you guys cover with the youth or tell them or expose them to, you know, as far as writing? I know there's drum workshops. There's all kinds of things going on at the world stage. So tell us, I want to know about the things that you guys do specifically with the youth, because that is really important, especially since they've taken art out of the schools.
Very true. Well, specifically, we have a flute workshop, which is a young children's workshop. Children from age 7 or 8 to 15 or 16. We also have a young children's orchestra. On Saturday, you can come in and see an orchestra of young children playing jazz.
Wow.
So these kinds of programs are, for all intents and purposes, gone out of the schools.
Yeah, they are.
So we try to maintain some of that important work. And then we in our own workshop, we invite young children to come in from time to time. Teachers will bring students in to view the programming, and in this way, we try to impart a sense of discipline when it comes to the writing.
Yeah.
Because clearly, you know that you have to write. You have to write regularly. You have to write daily. So we try to impart that into the students that come into our workshop, and not only that, we try to get them to see that you have to read, because it's almost unfathomable that you can meet a poet and ask the question, who do you like to read?
Right.
And they will say that they don't read poetry.
Right.
I almost don't take that poet seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you be a poet and not read poetry?
Exactly.
So these kinds of just simple tenets we try to impart to the youth. Because as you well know, you walk into a classroom, there's a high rate of illiteracy.
Yes. And it's really sad. Now I want to have you do you have another quick piece that you can do for us?
Well, it is, it's a fast moving poem. This is historical.
Okay.
And it's simply called Dream. And this is a dream that I have almost like over and over. And there is a character in the poem, Columbus. And just talking about the historical context a moment ago, when I was growing up as a child, I heard a story about Columbus that's very true, very different than the story that I've heard in recent years. And this shares the paradigm.
Okay.
It's called Dream. Ferdinand's argosies ease past Guinea, round Cape of Good Hope, like cobras through wet grass. Chains covet the bilge. Trinkets for a witch doctor's deceit. Christopher's rat-run galleon brands olas de sangre into my sleep. Swells ocean's indigo. Santa Maria's carnage. He scoffs. Find me, nigger. A rum-soaked scowl. Holes belch bodies. Jewels glint in Vespucci's midday Hispaniola sun. Sea vultures circle the mast. Bird dog yellow essence into eulogy's drum. Isabella's Igbo, Asante, Dogon, gutted by countless tides. Colonized bones writhe upon beaches, old dead burying new. When overseers smashed the drum, a hush solemn as moon glow gagged fields from New England to Toussaint's revolt. Massa, mean as Satan. Me dream, see him boil like Delta gumbo. Sever me foot if Congo call. I shudder. Claw from slumber. Skewered teal's purpled body leaks pearl river. I count limbs as white hoods gallop in my head.
Wow. And you have that dream?
I have that dream. Less and less the more I read the poem.
Right. So it's good that you got it, got it out.
Onto the page.
Onto the page. And so it doesn't, because it's very haunting.
Growing up as a child, after I began to learn about the slave experience,
Right.
truly learn about the slave experience, this resonated in my head many, many, many nights. Almost like sleeping in the hull of a ship.
Right. Wow.
And so literally getting it on the page is therapy.
Well, that's good, and I'm glad you got it on the page. And I want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing and blessing with us and telling us about treasures and the world stage. And we will definitely have you back.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
You're welcome. This has been Indie Encounter, a journey into the world of the independent creators of art and artistic communication. I want to thank today's guest, Jawanza Dumasani, for sharing his artistic vision with us. If you want to find out more about today's guest, check him out on Facebook or on the web by typing his name into your browser. You may also check out theworldstage.org. Check out our website here at PasadenaCommunityNetwork.com and select the Arroyo channel. You may also check out the website oneformark.com for additional information about our show. Thanks to our director, Lilia Fernandez Gaspar, and crew for making this show possible. Thanks to all of you. We hope to see you here again when we embark on another Indie Encounter.